Good morning. Welcome to the next webinar for the Health Data Exploration Project. As many of you who may be tuning in know, we do a webinar series associated with this project. This is a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded project run out of UCSD and Cal IT2 here in San Diego, California. The Health Data Exploration Project at a high level is a project focused on exploring barriers and facilitators to the use of personal health data for public health research. The project has a couple different components. We do core research through the initiative, and we also have funded a small number of agile research projects that have aimed to fund partners that consist of sort of more academic or policy folks partnering up with individuals from industry to explore how these types of data can be used for research. And so we're really delighted this morning to have another webinar from one of our Agile project grantees. This project is entitled Towards Privacy-Aware Research and Development in Wearable Health. And really delighted this morning to welcome Michelle DeMooy from the Center for Democracy and Technology, and I'll let her give a little bit more information about her background, as well as Shelton Ewan, who is the Vice President for Research at Fitbit. So I think it's going to be a terrific presentation this morning. So I'll turn it over to you, Michelle.
Great, thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us today. For some reason my microphone's not working, so I have headphones on, but I'm really glad I'm not on another call or anything like that. I'm with you guys, and I'm excited to talk about this project that's been about a year and a half in the making. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about CDT. CDT is a nonpartisan, nonprofit technology advocacy organization, and so we work on lots of different issues that are crucial to the vibrancy of the internet and to technology itself. So we work on free speech, we work on security and surveillance issues, open internet, net neutrality, and also consumer privacy, which now we've renamed to be privacy and data. And the reason for that is it's more than just privacy. There are a lot of different types of issues and frames that are coming into play, as we'll talk about a little bit later throughout this project. So Shelton, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are in Fitbit and your role in this project?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This has been a really exciting project. I think maybe unprecedented in its sort of partnership between sort of data privacy advocacy groups and industry in this new space. So again, my name is Shelton, and I'm the VP of Research at Fitbit. My role at the company and in my division is to look at technologies that are further reaching, new sensors, the invention of new sensors, new application areas, and basically just trying to invent the future of wearables, things that can be sensed on people and are useful for them. We do a lot of research taking data off of people, often ourselves, in fact, to try to figure out what can be measured. And it is really at the heart of how we think about this is, how do we make sure to give relevant information to people in a way that respects their data and their privacy, but also allows them to share it in ways that they feel comfortable with, because there's often a lot of social motivation to this type of data. Things like your step count. For instance, I don't know, Michelle, if you're wearing a Fitbit or not. I hope you are.
I have a watch.
Oh no!
Sorry,
watch.
Very non-technical. I know. I feel like I'm a dinosaur. I'm like a technological dinosaur over here. But I love my watch. I'm sorry. But hey, if you guys send me a free one, I will consider it.
Oh, okay. And then we can compete. But I mean, I think that's the core of it, right? So I would love to be able to beat you in your step count every day of the week.
I'm sure you would. I have no doubt. No doubt.
But I think the key to it, though, is knowing how that data is being shared and doing it in a way that we both feel comfortable about. And that's been very core to how we think about this as well. And so it's really exciting to get someone like CDT to really step in and understand how we do things and give us their insights on how to either improve or double down on in terms of what we do.
Yep. So I guess just to get rolling into our show, it's not too complicated. but we put it together to give you some visuals on what we're doing. And what we're going to do is take a little time to go through sort of the context for the paper, some information about the methodology, the process that we used, how we attempted to do this, and you know, some of the things, some of the interesting findings, and then we'll hopefully leave about 10 minutes at the end for maybe a little bit more for questions from the audience. Okay, so we went through a little bit about who we are and how well our logos go together. And Sheldon, I forgot that these were in here. Would you like to spend a little time on this? And maybe right now would be the best time to do that if you would, or we can just...
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to maybe go one slide back and just talk a little bit about the mission of Fitbit.
Sure.
I think I already gave that.
Yeah, great.
So I don't know how many people in the audience are aware of Fitbit, the company, but you know, there is this sort of new space of wearables, wearable technology and sensors on people that has been adopted a lot recently in the US and across the world. And Fitbit is a major player in this. I think we helped create this space close to 9 years ago. The overall mission and overarching theme of what we do is we try to provide tools for people so they can live healthier, more active lives. And that is a combination of like data through things like sensors that you wear, and also inspiration in the form of like social motivation tools, and guidance, that being things like insight or sort of surprising facts that can be derived from your data to help you understand more about yourself and how to stay motivated. So in this timeline, I don't know how many people can see it because it's a little bit small, but we started about 9 years ago. That's when we were founded. And in the very beginning, we made these little clip devices that you could wear on your body. And we were really trying to start this new wave of consumer electronics wearables where people could put sensors on themselves that are very easy to use, have long battery life, and just sort of fit into their lifestyle so they could focus on the things that are important to them. So they didn't have to worry so much about charging it. They didn't have to worry about where to place it. It could just fit on them in their bodies, and they could just wear them. And it will give them the sort of tools that they need to track their activity, sleep, and get motivation. That was really the idea that we started with, and we started with that clip. Since then, we've actually launched several more products, things that like this, which is called a Fitbit Blaze, where you can wear it on your wrist. And we've added a lot more sensors, things like heart rate, floor counting, you know, we have GPS, and we've added a whole bunch of other parts of it on the inspiration and guidance side, around things like challenges where you can compete with your friends and family, either on the weekend or the weekday, to try to move more and get social support. There's been a whole lot of stuff like that, and we've also included new sensors like a weight scale too. So now you can get a holistic view of things like your activity, sleep, weight, have that all in one place so you can, again, focus on the stuff that's important to you, whether it's losing a little bit of weight or gaining some weight, as it may be, getting more exercise, etc. Now, one thing that I think is kind of interesting is to maybe put enough about Fitbit. I think one thing that's interesting is to think about the data that we have. So part of the mission of the company and part of the promise of this is that we can collect this data and use it in a way that's meaningful for people. So that sort of necessitates looking at that data and then trying to drive interesting things for people. So, you know, a lot of people think of the wearable itself as this, or this consumer electronics monitoring stuff is this. And I think that's, you know, that's the very first thing that people see when they go into a store. But there's actually a lot more of the experience on things like your phone, where, you know, from your phone you can see things like graphs of your activity, and you can message with your friends in a social manner to try to, you know, get each other to move or to compete. There are also a lot of other sort of like infrastructure elements to that let's see, in terms of like getting insights to people so that they learn more about their lives. That's more what I wanted to, in those slides I just wanted to describe and make sure that people realize it's not just this device. There's a lot of different footprints to how technology intersects your life.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, well, we're trying to get Michelle back right now. Is she?
She's calling in.
Okay, she's calling in again. So do you, I mean, I don't know, Sheldon, if you, I think that's fascinating. I don't know if you want to or are able to say any more about how, you know, you envision those sorts of footprints being used. You know, what's the, you mentioned, you know, getting more data about people's activity, kind of what makes, like you said, what makes people tick. How do you, I mean, what do you see as being what we might learn from these data, you know, in the next 5 years, let's say?
Oh, yeah, it's kind of, I'll say, first of all, I think it's a little bit hard to predict. You know, when you have the largest biometric database that's ever existed, it's kind of hard to know what's going to come out of that. But some of the things we've already found are actually kind of, you might say they seem kind of obvious, but it's interesting because you can repeat basically academic studies that have been done for the last few decades at a huge scale. So, you know, we can determine things like men and women and how they sleep. So it's well known, in fact, that men and women don't sleep the same amount on average. I think a little bit less sleep than women. What's interesting, though, is that we've been able to find that in our data set, I unfortunately don't have the graph here, but I think up until about the age of 65, men get a little bit less sleep than women. And then at 65, that gap between men and women starts to narrow. It's not really clear why. I don't pretend to exactly know why. It might be because of retirement, you know, for instance. There are other things too. Like recently, we looked at the resting heart rate across the entire country, the United States, I should say.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when you show that map of the U.S. and all of its resting heart rate, it maps very closely to what like a CDC heart disease map looks like. Striking similarities there, and so it has huge implications for public policy and in terms of being able to see different regions and how their health behavior.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, you mentioned kind of being able to look these. You kind of alluded to the fact that, you know, there's research going on, like for example within Fitbit, to kind of make these maps and look at these data. Do you see like a fundamental shift happening with you know, kind of companies being the ones to kind of start to do more public health kinds of research, or, you know, how do you see the interplay between academics and companies?
Well, you know, I think, so in part, I think the reason why this study with CDT is so important is it'd be nice to understand the best practices for how to even approach this type of research.
Sure.
And I think we take that very seriously here, but we're very careful because we want to make sure to maintain the privacy of our users. You know, they don't sign up to be part of a big public policy study necessarily, and we want to maintain their privacy and have respect for them. But I will say that I do think that there's you know, there's a lot of public policy and sort of academic research going on already, and there's a huge opportunity for industry players like Fitbit to sort of work with them to try to inform this at large scale. I mean, I think you do see a shift already where this is being attempted, but I don't think it's as close a partnership as it could be.
Yeah, that's very it's interesting.
So if I could elaborate a little bit, I think one of the things that I think we're interesting in the early stages of working with CDT is that in this wearables industry, Fitbit and all the wearables companies are kind of in a different sort of technology space than we tend to think of for data privacy. So often when you look at sort of companies that are based on serving up ads, there's sort of a fundamental, like, you know, you get a service more or less for free, and then there's that data being turned around to generate revenue in the form of ads. Whereas in the wearables industry, it's kind of a separate, or a distinctly different way of thinking about it. We make sensors; they're supposed to collect data on people. That data is actually inherently private. It's stuff like your heart rate, stuff like your sleeping patterns. And people expect that we will actually take that data and get more insight out of it, and basically study that data in order to inform them and to help them. And I think that is a sort of fundamental shift that is very different, you know, because it can often be the case where technology is scary. In this case, technology is an enabler. The data is meant to actually enable people and help them. But there's this kind of dicey line between what is considered respectful or not.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think it's one of the great things about working with you guys is that you understand that, you know, and it's not that other companies don't, but that there's not necessarily the same sense of obligation to users, which, you know, I think just as an editorial, I think is a sort of not sustainable business perspective, but it's also just really important because of the potential, sort of what you were saying, the potential of what this stuff can do, what this data can do to improve, you know, lives, public health, so many things. So I think that is crucial. I think, you know, one of the things that I say, and I believe strongly, is that the data that's collected about us tells this narrative, right? It tells a lot about who we are, especially when it's biometric or health related. That kind of information is a story of our lives, our past, our present, our potential future, and so that is a big reason why it needs to be protected. I think CDT's role has been traditionally to look at where technology and privacy sort of intersect. Where are there questions? Where are there sort of the difficult places? And I think that's one of the places that the wearable industry is sort of in. And it's not that there isn't a way to solve it, but I think Shelton pointed out before, there's certain silos in terms of advocacy and companies and even government actors, and it's really unnecessary and it's actually unhelpful as far as moving forward on this stuff. One of the things I learned in this project was how much Fitbit had asked these questions, had really thought about a lot of the questions that we were asking, and had really tried to figure out what are the standards for this stuff. Where do I look to find out what is acceptable and what's not to my customers, to policymakers. And the thing about the wearable space is that there really those don't exist. So one of the goals that we had, and not just in working with the company, but in kind of creating recommendations that would resonate, something that is just specific enough to actually give guidance, but is replicable across different wearable companies. So hopefully we've done that. I don't know.
Okay. So next slide.
Okay. So I'll start talking about internal R&D. So far, I feel like I'm still the connection's still working, so I'll just keep going. One of the reasons that we chose internal research and development is that when you look at tech companies, we really feel like internal research and development is the beating heart of innovation. It is the sort of decider in some ways whether a company is going to last and make it, or whether they're not. I mean, the teams that are involved in research and development are looking at how are things functioning, but they're also looking at what's next. How do we, how do we sort of iterate on these products and services? And so we felt like that was an interesting place to look at data practices, and it's also the team that has the most facility with all kinds of data. So that was sort of the rationale. And one of the things that was fun about working with Fitbit during this time period was that the team of researchers went from 5 people, I think, right, or 5 or 10, around that, 5 to 10, and then went up to 30, right? Or I mean, I feel like every time I talk to you, it's more. So
yeah, close to 60.
Okay. Oh my God, 60. So the point being, this is actually a great, I think, way to come in and look at a company, because that's exactly the time period when a company needs to think about this stuff. When you think about what are our data practices, do we have policies in place? It can work when you have 5 to 10 people. Everybody kind of respects certain boundaries, but when you go to 60 or when you go to hundreds, there have to be certain practices established in policy, and thinking through a lot more of how information can get shared, how information should be handled or not handled. And so that was really important for us. And when we started the project, there are probably a bunch of researchers I hope there are a bunch of researchers listening to this. It's really difficult to think of a methodology for something that's, well, as far as I know, really never been done. I looked, I didn't see anything, and also a research paper that really is right. So we wanted it to be legit, and we wanted it to have heft, but it needed to be there needed to be a methodology that guided us through all of this information without using the same frameworks that we'd always used. Anybody who knows privacy, the privacy world, knows a lot of what we resort to is the fair information practice principles, and that's things like access and control, very important things. But in some ways they're outdated. In some ways they struggle to meet this modern world and some of the context of how data is shared and how data is collected. So we wanted to go in on this project without that preconceived notion. And so there's a methodology called the grounded theory. Grounded theory is basically a way to let the data guide you. Sort of, I think, in some ways what Shelton and what you guys do. You try to listen to be the data listener. And it's basically when you develop your hypothesis after you've looked at everything. So we started the project by interviewing 5 people on the research and development team, And that was truly a fascinating part of this project. We also collected information in emails and phone calls and other methods. But what we wanted to learn was, how do you form a research question? How do you decide a project's over? How do you decide that information is sensitive or not sensitive? All the questions that, in theory, I think a lot of advocates might sort of already have an answer to. I might say, well, this is sensitive data. Here's how FIPS define that. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be able to look at what the researchers told me, at what I was hearing about the practices and the way the data kind of came into a project. And that is how we approached this. And it was in 5 different phases. The first 4 were assessment, mapping, investigation, and analysis. And so in the first phase, we used all this self-reported data to try to kind of dig into how things are scoped and launched. And some of the fascinating things that we found out, I'll tell you a little bit later in the findings. One of the questions we had was, how do you determine, how do you report outcomes to users? So this is a really tricky question, and one that Fitbit is sort of constantly evolving, because the data changes. The types of sensors change, what they're able to do changes. And so, this was an important question, and we got some insight from the different researchers. We also took time to map the internal research process. I think Shelton was kind of like, yeah, that's close. It's not exactly right. But, this was a bunch of public policy people trying to map out, a very technical process. But that was really a part of helping us understand the process, but also something that we hope to use to identify these pivot points, as we were calling them, where a researcher would either ask a question or look for a resource or make a call. This is a bigger privacy question, or this is an ethical question, and here's the answers that I can choose from. Something that made it really intuitive and really easy, but also flexible so that it could change. And so that was the beginning of that map. The phase 3 investigation part was when we, and this is a part of the grounded theory, when we sliced the data and we took different sections and put them together to try to find commonalities. So instead of me deciding in advance that probably they'll anonymize sensitive data, what we did was we took different types of information, like the background of the researchers next to the process, the sort of way in which data was collected next to the way it was anonymized or not. And this revealed a lot of really interesting findings, again, that I'll go over in just a minute. I'm trying to tease you a little bit, because I'm assuming that half the people watching this might have left during my problematic technology situations. But anyway, if you're still here, there's some great findings that we'll go over in just a minute. And finally, we did analysis, and this is where this is where, in particular, CDT brings in our expertise. And we took all of these buckets of data and we tried to look at 2 concepts. So you're allowed to do this in grounded theory. It's not a hypothesis, but they're concepts, and ours were privacy and ethics. And there are different frameworks for how these are deployed. You can look at the fair information practice principles. You can also look at the common rule, how IRBs function, how are ethics determined now in terms of technology and research. Those were helpful to a point, but they're not, they aren't prescriptive. It's one thing to say justice, and justice is an important thing for any research to look towards. It's another thing to put that into the context of an internal R&D process where a lot of the data is anonymous. And it's another question, beneficence. How do you make sure that you're doing good? And so these were the types of questions that we tried to put into the context of an actual business reality. So when would something like justice come up? What does it mean to do beneficence? And so when we talk about our findings and our final recommendations, I'll show you how we sort of took those concepts and placed them into 3 frameworks. And then in phase 5, this was the drafting phase. And this has taken a while for various reasons, including the holidays and other things. But this was where we really wrangled with the information and tried to make it make sense, tried to make it not policy wonky and annoying, but something that a wearable company might be like, all right, you know what? Fitbit's doing this, we should do this. And this makes a lot of sense. This is not just about protecting privacy, it's about liability. It's about looking ahead, looking to the future, and understanding how much data we may hold someday. And so again, we kind of mashed all of this together and came out with recommendations that focused on individual dignity, operational stewardship, and the social good. Do you have any comments on that, Shelton? I know I was just talking for a while.
No, I don't have anything to add at the moment.
Okay. So I think, since I'm sure we're running a little bit behind, it might be worth diving into the findings. We learned a lot of interesting and surprising things, and at least they were to me. For example,
Michelle, just real
yes.
quick, I wanted to make sure since we're kind of doing the slides here, I wanted to make sure that we're on the right slide, or if we need to be on a different slide.
No, this is the right slide. This is fine.
Okay, good. Great.
Yeah, I'm jumping a little bit around, but this is basically the right slide. So what we looked at were some of the things that we found were that projects there are two kinds of projects and two kinds of ways in which researchers start, and one of them is a hack. And I think to a lot of researchers, they're sort of they don't understand why I think this is so fascinating. But the reason I think it's so fascinating is because I haven't heard it before, and I've spoken to a lot of tech companies, and it seems like it's a very simplistic idea, and the idea is you and maybe one other person play, right? You have an idea and you want to figure it out. You want to see if it's something that will go somewhere, and so you start to play around with sensors and hardware. You kind of get somebody on a treadmill. You're trying to see if a curiosity that you have is something that can bear fruit. And an interesting part of learning about the team was every single one of those researchers separately mentioned that hacks were one of the reasons why they worked at Fitbit. This was a huge value because it allowed them to explore this intellectual curiosity that people in this space have. These are very well-degreed, very smart people who need to have that creative flexibility. And I think it's also a sign of why Fitbit is sustainable, why Fitbit has done so well. So the hacks are shared with the full research and development team every month, and then decided whether or not this should go forward as a formal project. And projects are, after an idea is conceived and it's approved, there's sort of a discussion about it. There's a kickoff meeting, and they define the goals and the timeline for the project and the team. And so the teams are, hardware engineers, software engineers, data scientists, and human subject researchers, all very, very interesting and useful components to any kind of data project. And we found that to be something that was worth talking a little bit about in the paper. And then we looked at how does Fitbit use data? So in what context is the data collected and used, and how do they sort of categorize that? And so what we found was the first level of research project is a pilot study. And the data is collected on individual employees on the Fitbit team, and data is not anonymized unless the data for some reason is considered to be sensitive. So one of the more surprising findings of this project was that, in fact, and it makes a lot of sense, that the data subjects are employees of Fitbit. And it's something that I think like I said, it makes sense because especially when you're a smaller company, not only are people very enthusiastic about health and want to do it, but it's also, if you're just 3 people, you're going to ask somebody, like I said before, to jump on the treadmill and test out a sensor. Is this working? And so that was an interesting variable to this that we hadn't expected, and it helped when kind of framing what is sort of reality versus what is a kind of policy. So what we said was, in reality, this is going to happen, and this does not need to be anonymized, right? We don't need to tell Fitbit to anonymize this data unless for some reason they feel like it's sensitive, and unless they feel like there's some sort of special conditions that would make this particular data set more sensitive. But so that's one example of sort of the reality that we think makes sense. The internal user studies are the next step of this, and this is where the data is collected on Fitbit employees that are outside of the R&D team. So one of the other characteristics of the researchers that we found when we interviewed them was how the culture of health and wellness was really ingrained in almost everybody there. You know, they're biking, they're running, they care about this stuff, and they really believe in the mission of improving health of Fitbit users. And so, you know, they all have a Fitbit, of course. So anyway, the data controls and the levels of sensitivity for the internal Fitbit studies is done in a similar way to the way pilot studies are done, which is where they kind of apply context to the data. All the data in this study type, though, is anonymized, so that only the researcher collecting the data can match the data to an individual within a company. So that sounds good. You know, we thought that made a lot of sense. We made a couple of recommendations around how wearable companies might also apply a framework of ethics onto this kind of situation. So, you know, when you're a smaller company versus becoming a bigger company, company employees might be fine with doing it. It might then later the stakes might get higher, and there might be coercion involved. And you know, I don't think that that's the case very often or at Fitbit at all. But the question was, what about the bigger industry? What would happen, and how do we kind of protect the integrity of this research by making sure that it's not coercive or there's any way that an employee might feel uncomfortable about it? And Fitbit has done that. And then the final category was the Fitbit user studies. And this is data collected on users of Fitbit that are outside of the company. So this is what Fitbit views rightly as the most sensitive data, and it is anonymized even to the researcher. So, you know, and I just want to note, nobody is interested in really, you know, nobody wants to violate anyone's privacy, right? That's not why they're there. It's not the point of doing the research. And so they're really careful to try to make sure that steps are in place to anonymize this. And so we went into a couple more specific recommendations about how practices can identify what's sensitive and not, and how researchers might use tools that will kind of elevate sensitivity protections with sensitivities. And you know, we're even talking a little bit about some other issues for deletion and other kinds of questions that might come up during that process. And so just to get a little bit more into, and hopefully I'll stop talking at some point, and Shelton, please jump in if you have anything to add. So the way that we broke it down, as I mentioned earlier, was we put it into 3 frameworks. The first was individual dignity. And I know it sounds a little bit mushy, but it's an important concept because it combines the concepts of privacy and ethics. And you know, not that many frameworks do that. And the concept of the dignity of your user, is an especially important one, we think. And so in this section, we say, for example, any data gathered about company employees should be considered sensitive and stored separately from other employee-related data sets. We say that data aggregation should be the default research method, that it provides, because it provides a broader view of sensor function and user behavior and user trends, but without the sort of possible privacy risks that would entail. We go into a lot more detail about how data practices might impact an individual, and a lot of it is about privacy, but a lot of it also is about control and making sure that an individual feels informed, feels like they understand for the most part where their data is going and why, and has as much control as possible over that. Another type of recommendation that was within the individual dignity framework was making sure that there's straightforward information exchange. And this is something that I think most people are frustrated with in the online world. You know, privacy policies are just dry and crazy, and nobody wants to read those. Fitbit's is actually really good. I read it, and I was able to get through it without, you know, throwing my computer across the room. The important point of this is I think companies feel constrained by these notices, you know, as these sort of regulatory ways to kind of head off different, you know, liabilities. And that is absolutely, in my opinion, the wrong approach. The right approach is to try to meet your user where they are, not just to put things in terms that they can understand, but maybe use other methods like audio and visual methods that can communicate to a broad cross-section of consumers. That's a part of respecting individual dignity, giving people the tools that they need to understand how their data is being used. And then I'll just go into the 2 more really briefly. The second 2 categories, one was operational stewardship. And the idea behind this was that companies are stewards of our data. You know, they are there to collect and help and interpret this information, and that there should be rules and sort of guidance around this. And so what we meant by that was not just practices, but also culture. How do you build a culture of data stewardship in a company when you're kind of feeling this pressure to get things to market quickly, to make sure that they're monetized, to make sure everything is moving forward? So some of the things that we found at Fitbit, we decided were actually really good examples of how to create that kind of culture of data stewardship. And one of them was looking at the backgrounds of your researchers. So a lot of the researchers on the team, probably all of them, have multiple degrees, and so what that means in reality is that they've all been, for the most part, through an IRB. So they have dealt with ethical issues, they have applied it to the understanding of how different forms of ethical standards might affect the way that they practice a project, etc. This was really, really helpful. And this was something that we felt like Fitbit had this culture of privacy that was there, but they weren't even necessarily aware of it. And so making that something that's more formalized, saying, we're going to hire, we're not just going to, oh, look, there are people here with these different backgrounds, but we're going to strategically say, we're going to hire people that have this understanding so that we can sustain this culture of privacy, not just with 5 people, but with 60. And one of the ways that I think we also mentioned before was making sure that there are formal policies, not just around hiring, but around all the data practices, making sure that there is a conversation that goes on regularly in a company about data stewardship. This is it's as much a marketing message as it is a policy message. It's something, it's sort of a standard of communication that companies set or don't. And I think the problem with not setting that sort of standard and saying this is what we care about and this is why we're doing this, you sort of have different motivations and employees in different backgrounds, and that will just come into play naturally when they interact with data. If you're from the marketing department, you have a different purview. But when you start with formal policies and this generates out from the internal research and development team, we think it will resonate. And so I think finally I just want to talk a little bit about the community good, the social good portion of our report. So, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of potential for this information to really improve public health. And, when we talk to people at Fitbit and kind of looking at their different products and services, they obviously, this is a part of their mission, right? They aren't just, trying to make flashy things. They're trying to help people manage and be stewards of their own health. And which, studies show this improves outcomes. All of these things are super important. What we wanted from companies in the wearable space was that they would make a commitment to doing this, as opposed to saying, well, yes, we care about that, and look, we've done some things. We want companies to say, we're going to allocate resources to this. We care about this, and we are saying, we have a commitment to the public good. And that means we have projects that work on things that matter to the public at large, obesity, heart disease, things that, there may be a role to play, maybe not for every device and every wearable, but there are some where there's a role that they can play, and we want to encourage that. Also, we want, as much as possible, for the companies to share some of their data sets publicly. So, and Fitbit has done this periodically for various reasons, different kinds of hacks for the Super Bowl or other kinds of projects. And what we want is for there to, along with this commitment to try to, advance the public good, that some of these data sets get to be made public so that the public and other researchers can look at them and manipulate them and try to understand, what the data means and how it can be used to leverage better health outcomes in different communities. And speaking of different communities, the final recommendation that we made in the community good portion of this was that data sets need to be inclusive. And what that means is, looking at some data sets for demographic information. And I realize this may sound counter to privacy, but it's not. This is possible to do in a privacy protective way, and Fitbit knows how to do that. And the key is when you look at the different types of communities that are in your data sets, who's missing? And this is something that a lot of companies, I think personally, fail to really address. And partly because it's hard, partly because they are focused on other types of projects. We think you need to make sure that all kinds of ethnicities and different communities, different sexualities, etc., that these groups of people are represented in the data sets so that there's sort of an inclusive approach to research. And so with that, I'll stop for now. And Shelton, please weigh in on any of the billion things that I just talked about.
Well, I don't want to drag the conversation too back, but I do think one of the really interesting things that we kind of learned, we've always taken privacy very seriously, but when you came in and interviewed us and sort of reflected on what you'd seen working with us, one of the things that really surprised me was the sort of coercion aspect. So at a small wearables company or small biometric monitoring company, almost everyone wants to contribute and do these experiments. That's sort of the culture that gets fostered. And it almost becomes like first nature to just ask someone, say, hey, can you do this for me? And as a company gets larger, there's this sort of maybe strange pressure that can occur, you can imagine, where if I ask someone, hey, can you do this for me, it may not feel like a voluntary thing anymore. It may not feel like a question. And I thought that was a really interesting insight where you can make sure that it's phrased very carefully so that the person who's being asked knows it's really voluntary. It has no outcome on their employment. It really is just a voluntary thing. And that's something that I think we have since enacted very intentionally here to make sure that everyone knows that when you participate in studies, it's really voluntary. It's just because you want to do it. And in cases, there are often like small monetary rewards for it, so that it's really a thing that's outside of your job duties.
Right.
The other thing that I thought was really interesting was, and this was sort of intentional as we started constructing the team, as we looked for people who had experience with IRB and human subjects experiments. It's part of what we have to do on a daily basis. Since the whole study was done, we've actually sort of tripled down on that and hired in many people with human subjects experience, and actually instituted an IRB process within Fitbit as well. And I think this is a credit to part of this relationship, but also I think it also shows maybe the other side of it, which is I think a lot of wearable companies when they're starting out, or anyone sort of dabbling in this space, if you have people who first of all have experience doing human subjects experiments, experiment on themselves, and then ask the question, would I want this shared with anybody?
Right.
Ask that question.
Yeah.
Usually is a great framework to start like the rest of it down the road. When you start enlisting other volunteers, when you start looking at anonymized data sets down the road.
Yeah. I remember, I think in one part of the report we touch on that as a part of this sort of culture of privacy that we were not expecting necessarily, but in that, intrinsically doing research on data was very personal to the researchers for that reason.
So I have a question. I think this is it's fascinating, and it's, thank you both for sharing this with us today and for doing the work. So I was really interested as well, Michelle, when you started talking about the types of researchers that, you sort of discovered were at Fitbit kind of doing this work. And so Sheldon, I guess my question for you is, here at UCSD in this field, we think a lot about how partnerships between academia and industry can go forward, and sort of what are the barriers to making that happen, or should that be happening? Perhaps there are other models. And so it sort of sounds like, to some extent, you at Fitbit, there is a team of researchers who are sort of doing the work within the company, and I'd be curious to hear more about how you identify what type of researchers you want to bring on board, how you recruit them, and just sort of that culture, I guess.
I'll try to be brief about it, but I think in many ways the research team at Fitbit is a lot like if you were to take the sort of biomedical practices in academia or in any sort of industry research environment, and then try to map it to consumer electronics. That's sort of the approach that we have. So the biomedical research environment is typically one that's with a bunch of diverse expertise areas. You'll have like an electrical engineer sitting next to a surgeon, sitting next to a statistician. They all sort of sit together, they come up with great, crazy, awesome new ideas for biomedical applications, and then they go off and do it. And we do the same thing, but now it's geared more towards this consumer electronics world. So you have to think about your battery life, your form factors, actual consumer-grade electronics, and then you have people who are maybe versed in biomedical engineering directly, or have a real bent towards these application areas where it sort of involves wellness and motivation.
Great. Another question I had was just, Michelle had also mentioned sort of a recommendation around encouraging companies to share data publicly, which I know can or at least from what I understand, can be a big challenge for companies, wanting to, for the very reason of wanting to protect their users and so forth. Maybe you could say a little bit more from the perspective of Fitbit. I mean, if you consider making some data available publicly, I mean, what are the issues you consider, and how big of a risk is that? What are some of the issues?
Michelle, did you hear the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think she was asking
sorry,
you.
It was directed at you, Shelton.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was for you.
I'm happy to answer it, but I think you'd be better suited.
I see. So I think it would be great to find a way in which we can generate these data sets in a sort of de-identified and anonymized fashion to share with external researchers. I think one thing that came across in the CDT recommendations too were that in sharing this kind of data, you make a commitment from the external researchers, so the third-party academic researchers, that they won't try to re-identify the data. Because there have been many instances now in academic research, you take de-identified data sets and you re-identify the people. We feel very strongly that that should not happen, and it'd be great to have commitments from the people receiving the data that they won't do that. Because try as you might, there's usually some information there. The other thing is, I think there's a sort of ethical question. I almost want to pose it to you, Michelle. Should a user opt into this type of exercise first, as opposed to just taking the data we have and then sort of packaging it up and sending it out?
So you're asking, should they agree to something like that in the beginning versus periodically?
Yeah,
that's a tricky question. I think, for me, I think the answer is periodically, even though I know that that's annoying to people in some ways, but it follows what I think makes sense in terms of expectations. So, originally people give, they want you to take this data. I mean, they want you to interpret it for them, and that makes a lot of sense. When it starts to go into a more public realm, I think it's fair to ask them again, acknowledging that the risk of de-identification is very low. And that you have, maybe letting them know the best practices that you've done. We've signed agreements to make sure that this is not, nobody's trying to re-identify this. But I do think that asking people, again, it would be a best practice there.
So we have only a couple minutes left in the webinar, but we do have one quick question from a viewer. And so I'm just going to read it out. Okay. Now that Fitbits are being used in many research studies across the country, has this work changed any of your policies with respect to working with external researchers? So I assume this is for Shelton, and it's from Kevin Patrick, our HDE PI.
Okay, thank you. So in brief, the answer is no. It hasn't influenced the way we've approached it so far. I don't know if you're aware, but Fitbit has actually had an open API for a long time. I think we may have been the first wearables company to do that. And we also have a partner API that's it gives more fine-grained data for researchers and people who want to work in our ecosystem. So a lot of these third-party research studies that are going on with like post-operative outcomes type research, that kind of stuff, they often work with us in integrating into our API, and then they get informed consent from their users right off the bat.
Got it. Got it.
And
okay. Well, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to comment that we help support that and in sort of establishing how that API should work.
Great, great.
I think that's a pretty different model. I just want to point out from other companies, and I think that's a really privacy protective and security enabled way to do that.
Right. Well, we need to wrap up, but I just want to thank you both for your presentation this morning. I think this has been just a really interesting webinar and such an interesting project. And Michelle, we really appreciate the thoughtful approach you've taken to this work and the study design and the execution. And Shelton, we really appreciate your willingness and Fitbit's willingness to participate and, like Michelle said, kind of open up your process. So that the community as a whole can learn more about how we can leverage these data while protecting users and participants, but also be able to use the data for, like you said, sort of public good and public health research. So thank you both. We really appreciate it. And
thank you.
We'll sign off now.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. See you later, Shelton.